Bad Beat Media. Good to see you again, Peter.
Good to see you, Kareem.
Yes. So, yeah, lots of things have happened these days, and I thought I'll just have a chat with you about all the things that we've seen, and I've noticed like this you could almost say a red line going through all the topics I would like to discuss with you today, starting with Dr. Cornel West's refusal, or actually, what was it? His resignation letter.
Yeah.
He has written to
Apparently,
Harvard,
right.
right?
Apparently, he had been recommended for tenure by the relevant committee or his department, and then the administration rejected it.
Right, and um, he talks about the spiritual rot of higher education, of in particular Harvard, but also of the neoliberal universities, institutions you see in the West. And he talks about this spiritual rot that you see. Let me first quickly share the screen so people can see it. So here you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Cornel West accuses Harvard of spiritual rot in resignation letter. And I think we can extrapolate this to the West in general. What we will talk about today is that we have this really decaying spiritual rot of society, I would say, which is very evident in first of all, in our institutions, and in particular, in this case, in our universities. And Cornel West, he writes a one-page letter about the fact that there is an intellectual and spiritual bankruptcy in Western education, and that that it has been a steady decline and decay in our part of the world. And as you can see here as well, he also really blasts the market drivenness of our universities, the neoliberalization, the privatization, you could almost say, of our universities.
And I think that's a key linkage to point out that it's the market-driven nature of the university is very much linked to the spiritual rot. It reminds me of this really creepy thing that Margaret Thatcher said. That she said something like, "Economics is the method," or she said, I think she misspoke. She said, "Economics are the method, but the purpose is to change souls."
Right.
So, that I think that's been quite successful, that project. The neoliberal project, I think, has done a lot to change souls by making us more competitive, thinking of ourselves more as individual competitors in a kind of rough and tumble jungle out there, whether it's in the private sector in business, whether it's in universities. It's the same ethic of individual competition. And then, so I think that's very much linked.
Yeah, exactly. Very good what you say there. And it's amazing how prophetic Margaret Thatcher was with regards to neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And indeed, this market-driven rot you see in Western universities is actually very, how you can, symptomatic, is a symptom you see actually in every aspect of Western society, what we will talk about today. For example, dealing with coronavirus, the way racism is still going on in our societies, imperialism, for example, US imperialism towards Cuba. So all these things pretty much come down to one thing, I think, and that is right what you see here, this market-driven capitalist rot of our societies that really decay everything on every level: education, race/ethnicity relationships, dealing with disasters like coronavirus, and on. And you see it with Dr. Cornel West, and he says it himself, is that when universities are privatized, education, the way our intellectual development is privatized, and big donors, huge, powerful donors are putting money in these universities, what happens is of course, these universities will not study or express views that go against these big, powerful donors because they will lose their money. Okay, this is this market-driven system. And who are big, powerful donors to Harvard University? Of course, many times pro-imperialist, pro-Israel kind of very wealthy Americans. And what you see then is when you have somebody like Cornel West, who is not only a Black academic, and that already is a marginalized position in the United States, but also a very, very strong supporter of marginalized communities like the Palestinians. When you go for tenure as one of the most leading academics and public intellectuals, you get refused. Your tenure gets refused, which is just such a blatant example of the sickness of our system. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes from top to bottom. So you were talking about the top of universities, but even at the bottom, I just looked up the data on tenure, and in 2018, the Chronicle of Higher Education reported that somewhere in the 20% range of faculty at universities in the U.S. today are tenured, and only 10% are on a tenure track. So basically what that means is you've seen this change in universities throughout the United States and in other parts of the world, away from these institutions where scholars could go, they would be on a tenure track. So basically they would do their research work, they would do their teaching, but then after 4, 5, 6 years, they would have a permanent job. So they would have job security, something that's incredibly rare in our neoliberal economic system around the world today. But the key thing about that job security was it gave you the freedom to pursue whatever research that you wanted to. Without that, and this is just at the bottom, then you have to be very concerned about all sorts of other worries, like is my research going to be perceived as too controversial? Is it going to anger people and make me even less likely to ever get job security? So even at the very bottom of the university structure, you have this kind of spiritual rot or market driven kind of corruption, corrupting the purpose of a university as a place for the free pursuit of knowledge. And then, yeah, as you said, at the very top, then you have influence from major donors. So you have, I think what's happening to Cornel West here is not too dissimilar to what happened to MLK Jr. when, he was only talking about the plight of Afro-Americans.
MLK, just for the audience, you mean Martin Luther King?
Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr., yeah. When he was only talking about the plight of African-Americans, the racism that they faced in the Jim Crow South, he had a lot of support among the white liberal establishment of the United States. But then when he started talking about Vietnam, when he started saying that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, when he started talking about economic issues, making his message more, cross-race, class-based, that's when he started to lose the support of the white liberal establishment. And people don't realize that he was quite unpopular actually a few years before he was assassinated, because he touched on these issues that were where there was a massive disagreement among the more powerful elements of society. And here you have the same thing. I'm sure if Cornel West spoke only about racism itself and didn't touch on any sort of geopolitical issue like U.S. support for Israel versus the Palestinians, I'm sure he would be tenured today.
Yeah, and not just that. I think if he only speaks about the watered down kind of racism, where we talk about bad words and that kind of stuff, but never about systemic racism, structural racism that is deeply embedded in our institutions and that can only be undone, for example, by huge reparations. We're going into the trillions, so to speak, to really cross that wealth gap of hundreds of years of slavery versus colonial domination, So I totally agree with you. So again, if what happens with this spiritual rot of market-driven universities is that, of course, you have to listen to what the elite wants to hear, what elites want to hear. You see the same with mainstream media, which are run by market-driven forces. And of course, what happens is mainstream media starts to talk in a way that is not offending big money, so to speak. Yeah. And And that brings me also to this idea that still is in the heads of many of the Asian students. Okay, which frustrates me. As a professor here in Hong Kong, and you as well, who teach at one of the world's leading institutions. I mean, we cannot deny that. Yet we still have this idea here in Hong Kong, for example, but many parts of Asia, that to get a good education, you have to go to one of these propaganda machines in the West, where you have to be, well, not too much against imperialism, where international relations is purely a Western Eurocentric discussion about state relations and inter-country competition and all that watered down stuff, without ever really focusing on more critical reflection of that very propagandistic social science.
Yeah, and they just basically assume that like interstate relations in Europe for the past 500 years describe human nature. They basically make
exactly.
that yeah,
exactly. And I think that is a big problem. The fact that a lot of people around the world, and in particular here in Asia, still think they have to go to Harvard or Cambridge to get a good education. While that may have been the case during the old days when the West was the center of the world, a colonial superpower. And I say the West very broadly, of course. We were talking mainly about the UK and the United States afterwards. And that it's still that myth that is in a lot of people's minds. What do you think? What would you say to Asian students when they say like, oh, I want to do my PhD at Harvard, and while they have the chance to do it here at a great Chinese university, for example, as well. What do you think when you hear that?
Well, I think it's a matter of, our brains are limited. We can't possibly absorb all the knowledge in existence. So when it comes to judging universities, it's really easy just to go by brand names. The brand name of Harvard or Yale or Cambridge or whatever, that has spread very widely, and it's associated with quality. And if you don't know much about the university structure overall in the world, then you can kind of be forgiven for just going with the easy thing. Like, what do you want to drink? I'll drink a Coke rather than a cola that you don't know. I think it's really at that level of sophistication. But when somebody asks me, where should I go to study? I say, well, I can't answer that question until I know what you plan to study, because there is no one university that is superior in every single field. You really have to look at the area you're interested in studying. Then you have to look at who's teaching, who's done the work that you think is the best, because there are plenty of debates to be had over what approach to any given field is the best. And it never correlates perfectly with the sort of brand name recognition of a university. If a student said that they want to go study economics, I would say, one of the last places I would recommend would be Harvard.
Exactly.
I would, University of Missouri, Kansas City would be my first recommendation. Then Stony Brook. It all varies by topic, but people go by brand names.
Yeah, and not just that. I think it's also a remnant of of our colonial past, of course, where we were all indoctrinated with this idea that the West was the center of the world and the center of humanity, and we didn't need to go anywhere or look to any other place in the world. If you wanted to develop yourself as a human being, you had to be in Europe or you had to be in the United States. Even though we slowly crawling out of that how can I say that, almost that trance, yeah, by opening up to the history of the rest of mankind. And we realized that pretty much all over the world you had this fascinating intellectual history of human progress, creativity and intellectualism and so forth. So I really think that what happened here with Harvard and Dr. Cornel West is an important, I think, and a pivotal moment in Western hegemony with regards to education, because it's you see it now on so many levels. It's like we are really living, all of us, we're living the decay of the West, so to speak. And this is one of the crucial examples, one of the biggest pillars of Western expression of greatness and excellence was, of course, its educational institutions such as Harvard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.